The hospice smelled of antiseptic and fresh flowers. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move both too quickly and unbearably slow, where the sound of a clock ticking could feel like a mercy or a threat. I'd never thought I'd spend so much time in a place like this, but life has a way of dragging you into corners you never imagined. Every morning, I walked the same path through the hallways. The routine had become second nature. Say hello to the nurses, nod at the other visitors, and carry the small sketchbook tucked under my arm like a talisman. My brother, James, would be waiting in his room, his once vivid energy dimmed by the cancer that now consumed his body. He tried to hide his exhaustion with jokes and smiles, but his voice carried the brittle edge of someone running out of time. It was on one of those mornings that I first noticed her. She wasn't like the other nurses, always busy and brisk, their smiles polite but distant. No, she moved differently, calm, deliberate, like she belonged to a quieter world. Her uniform was neat, her dark hair tied back in a simple braid, and when she looked at me, her eyes didn't just glance over me. They seemed to see through me. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice as steady as her gaze. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Words had been difficult for me lately, especially with strangers. "Heading to see James?" she asked, tilting her head toward his room. "Yes," I said, clearing my throat. "He's my brother." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "He talks about you, says you're an artist." I glanced at the sketchbook under my arm, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I try to be." She didn't press, didn't ask the usual follow-up questions people do when they're trying to be polite. Instead, she simply said, "He'll be glad you're here." Then she turned and walked away, her steps as quiet as her voice. I didn't know her name yet, but she stayed in my mind as I sat by James's bed that day, sketching the lines of his face while he dozed off. There was something about her, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. The next time I saw her, I was sitting in the small garden behind the hospice, my sketchbook balanced on my knees. I liked to sit there when the weight of the room became too much, when I needed to breathe in air that didn't feel so heavy. "You're good," she said, startling me. I looked up to see her standing a few feet away, her arms crossed but her posture relaxed. "Excuse me?" I asked. She nodded toward the sketchbook. "You're drawing. It's good." I glanced down at the half-finished sketch of a rose bush and shrugged. "It's just something to pass the time." "Doesn't look like just something to me," she said, her tone warm but firm. "Mind if I sit?" I gestured to the bench beside me, and she sat, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm Lily," she said after a moment. "Thomas," I replied. We didn't talk much that day. She asked a few questions about my drawings, about James, but she didn't push when my answers were short. Instead, she sat quietly, her presence as steady as the garden around us. Over the weeks that followed, I began to notice her more. She had a way of brightening the small, somber world of the hospice. Whether it was through her gentle encouragement with patients or the soft humor she used to calm their families. She seemed to know when to speak and when to stay silent, when to step in and when to step back. James adored her. He called her the boss with a crooked grin, and she would roll her eyes but laugh anyway. She had a way of drawing people out of their shells, of making even the most difficult moments feel a little less unbearable. One afternoon, while James was sleeping, Lily found me in the garden again. This time, I was sketching the view of the hospice building, its lines stark against the gray sky. "Do you ever paint?" she asked, sitting beside me. "I used to," I said, not looking up, "but I haven't in a while." "Why not?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight I wasn't sure I was ready to face. "I guess it just feels pointless right now." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "It's not pointless. Art doesn't have to fix anything. Sometimes it's just about helping you get through." I looked at her then, surprised by the certainty in her voice. There was something in her expression, something that suggested she knew exactly what she was talking about. Over time, our conversations grew longer, deeper. She told me about her childhood in a small coastal town, about her decision to become a nurse, and the moments that had made her question that decision. I told her about James and me, how we'd grown up inseparable until life pulled us in different directions. He always believed in me more than I believed in myself, I said one evening, my voice barely above a whisper. Even now, when he's the one fighting, he still tries to keep me going. That's what family does, Lily said, her gaze steady. They carry you when you can't carry yourself. Her words stayed with me, lingering in my mind like the scent of flowers in the garden. She was right, of course. But it wasn't just James who was carrying me. It was her, too. It wasn't until one evening, weeks later, that I began to sense something more beneath her calm exterior. We were sitting in the garden again, the sun dipping low on the horizon, when I noticed her wince as she reached for her water bottle. "Are you okay?" I asked, frowning. She waved me off, her smile too quick to be convincing. "Just a long day. Nothing to worry about." But as I watched her, a seed of doubt took root in my mind. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from a busy shift, but something deeper, something heavier. I didn't press her, not then. But the thought lingered, and with it came a growing sense of unease. Lily had a way of carrying the weight of others with grace, but I couldn't help but wonder, who was carrying hers? I didn't know it yet, but that question would change everything. The hospice had a way of making days blur together, time measured not in hours but in moments, moments of relief, of laughter, of pain. It was during one of those strange, in-between days that I started to notice the cracks in Lily's carefully constructed facade. She still moved through the halls with her steady grace, offering kind words to patients and their families. But there were times when her smile faltered, when she looked away too quickly or leaned against a wall as if to catch her breath. I told myself it was nothing. Everyone has off days, but a part of me couldn't let it go. James noticed it too. "You like her?" he said one afternoon, his tone light but probing. "Who?" I asked, though I knew exactly who he meant. "Don't play dumb," he said with a smirk. "Lily. You like her." I sighed, setting my sketchbook down on the chair beside me. "She's kind, easy to talk to, and pretty," James added, his grin widening despite the fatigue etched into his face. "Okay, fine. Yes, she's pretty," I admitted, feeling a flush rise to my cheeks. "But that's not the point." "What is the point, then?" he asked, his tone softening. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know. She's different. There's something about her. Like she gets it, even without me having to explain." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe because she's been through it, too." The weight of his words settled in the room, heavy and unspoken. It wasn't long after that conversation that I saw her sitting alone in the garden. It was unusual for her to take a break during her shift, and as I approached, I noticed how pale she looked, how tightly she gripped the edge of the bench. "Hey," I said, sitting down beside her. "You okay?" She turned to me, her smile faint but not quite reaching her eyes. "Just a long day." "That's the second time you've said that," I replied, my voice gentle but firm. "And I'm not buying it." She laughed softly, though the sound lacked its usual warmth. "You're persistent, you know that?" "Only when I'm worried," I said. Her smile faded, and for a moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I guess I haven't been feeling great lately. Probably just stress." I wanted to believe her, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. "You should see someone," I said carefully, "just to be sure." "I will," she said, though her tone made it clear she was just trying to placate me. We sat in silence for a while after that, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice quiet. "For what?" "For caring," she said, meeting my gaze. "Not everyone does." Her words stayed with me long after she left the garden. Over the following weeks, I tried not to let my worry for her consume me, but it was impossible to ignore the changes. She seemed thinner, more tired, her movements less fluid. James noticed it too, though he didn't bring it up again. One afternoon, as I sat by his bedside sketching, he glanced at the drawing and frowned. "Is that Lily?" he asked. I looked down at the page and realized I'd been absent-mindedly sketching her profile, the soft curve of her face, the braid that always rested over her shoulder. Yeah, I admitted, feeling a little embarrassed. James smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. She's hiding something, he said softly. You see it, don't you? I nodded, my throat tightening. I just don't know what it is. Maybe you should ask, he said. I don't want to push her, I said, though the idea had been lingering in my mind for weeks. James didn't press the issue, but his words hung in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. The chance came sooner than I expected. It was late one evening, long after visiting hours, when I found Lily sitting in the break room. Her head was resting on her arms, and for a moment, I thought she might be asleep. But when I stepped closer, she looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and glassy. Thomas, she said, her voice hoarse. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, I replied, sitting down across from her. She tried to smile, but it crumbled almost immediately. It's been a rough day. Lily, I said, my voice soft but firm. Talk to me. She hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. It's nothing, really. Her voice trailed off, and she looked away. You don't have to do this alone, I said, leaning forward. Whatever it is, you can tell me. For a moment, I thought she might brush me off again. But then she took a shaky breath and said, I've been sick for a while now. Her words hit me like a blow, and it took a moment for me to find my voice. Sick? What do you mean? She looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. Cancer. I was diagnosed last year. I went through treatment, and for a while it looked like I was in the clear. But recently, she didn't need to finish the sentence. The weight of it was written all over her face. I felt a mix of emotions: shock, anger, sadness. But above all, I felt a deep, aching sense of helplessness. Why didn't you tell anyone? I asked, my voice trembling. She shrugged, tears slipping down her cheeks. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want people to look at me the way you're looking at me now. I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. You're not a burden, Lily, and I'm not going anywhere. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. You don't have to do this, she said softly. I'm not your responsibility. You're not a responsibility, I said. You're my friend, and I care about you. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time, it felt like we were on even ground, both of us stripped bare of pretense. That night, as I walked back to my car, I couldn't stop thinking about her strength, her fear, her quiet determination to carry this burden alone. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would do whatever it took to carry it with her. Lily's confession changed everything. It wasn't just the way I saw her. It was the way I saw the world around us, the quiet strength she carried, the fragility of time. Knowing she was sick felt like holding something impossibly delicate in my hands, a piece of glass that could shatter with one wrong move. But Lily didn't change. She still showed up every day, her uniform pressed, her voice steady, her smile bright. She still sat with patients, held their hands, and reassured their families, as though the weight she carried didn't exist. It amazed me, the way she seemed to hold herself together when everything inside her must have been falling apart. I tried to respect her space, to give her room to let me in on her terms. But every time I saw her falter, pausing to catch her breath, gripping the edge of a table for balance, I had to fight the urge to step in, to do something. You're hovering, she said one afternoon, catching me watching her as she stacked charts at the nurse's station. I'm not hovering, I said, though my tone betrayed me. She raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in her tired eyes. You're worse than some of my patients' families. Maybe that's because you're worse at taking care of yourself than some of your patients. I shot back. The corner of her mouth twitched, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But then she sighed, leaning against the counter. I'm doing the best I can. I know, I said softly, but you don't have to do it alone. Her expression softened, and for a brief moment, I saw the vulnerability she worked so hard to hide. "I appreciate it, Thomas," she said. "Really. But I need to handle this in my own way." Her words stayed with me as I sat by James's bedside that evening. He was awake, though his breathing was shallow, his voice little more than a rasp. "You look distracted," he said, his eyes half-lidded but sharp. "I'm fine," I said, though it was obvious I wasn't. "Lily?" he asked, a knowing look on his face. I hesitated, then nodded. "She's sick. She told me a few days ago." James closed his eyes for a moment, his brow furrowing. "She didn't want anyone to know, did she?" "No," I said, "and I get it. She doesn't want to be seen as fragile or helpless. But it's hard to just stand by and do nothing." James chuckled, though it turned into a cough.
"Sounds familiar."
I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You've been trying to do the same thing," he said, his voice soft but pointed. "Pretending you're okay when you're not. Trying to carry all of this by yourself." Me, the hospice, Lily. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. He was right, of course. I'd been so focused on being strong for everyone else that I hadn't stopped to consider what it was costing me. "You don't have to fix everything, Thomas," James said, his hand resting on mine. "Sometimes, just being there is enough." The simplicity of his words cut through me, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself exhale. The next time I saw Lily, she was in the garden, her hands resting on the arm of a bench. She looked pale, her eyes shadowed, but her posture was calm, her expression serene. "Shouldn't you be inside resting?" I asked, sitting beside her. She smiled faintly. "I could say the same to you." "I'm not the one who's sick," I said before I could stop myself. Her smile faded, and she looked away, her fingers curling around the edge of the bench. "I don't want this to change things," she said quietly. "I don't want you or anyone else treating me differently because of it." "I'm not treating you differently," I said. "I'm just worried." She glanced at me, her expression softening. "I know, but I don't want to be defined by this, Thomas. I don't want it to be the only thing people see when they look at me." "I don't see you that way," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "When I look at you, I see someone strong, someone who carries more than anyone should have to. And I want to help. If you'll let me." Her eyes glistened, and she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, "but on one condition." "Anything," I said. "You have to let me help you too," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You've been carrying a lot too, Thomas, and I don't think you've let yourself feel it." Her words hit me harder than I expected, but I nodded. "Deal." In the days that followed, something shifted between us. We spent more time together, both inside the hospice and out in the garden. We talked about everything and nothing. Her favorite books, my old art school days, the way the world seemed quieter in the early hours of the morning. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, she asked me about my paintings. "You've never shown me any of your finished work," she said, her tone teasing. "Are you hiding something?" "Not hiding," I said, though I felt a twinge of embarrassment. "Most of my work is back at my studio. I haven't painted much since James got sick." She frowned. "You should. I think it would help." "Help with what?" "With everything," she said simply. "You don't have to carry the weight of the world all the time, Thomas. Sometimes creating something is the best way to let go of it." Her words stayed with me long after she left that evening. That night, for the first time in months, I set up my easel in James's room and began to paint. I didn't know it then, but that moment, her encouragement, my decision to pick up a brush again, would become the foundation of something neither of us could have anticipated. The hospice garden was quiet, the early morning light casting long shadows across the grass. I stood by the greenhouse, my easel set up, a half-finished painting before me. The colors swirled together, blues and greens, soft pinks and golds, a reflection of the garden that Lily and I had spent so many hours in. She arrived just as I was adding the final touches to a flower, her footsteps soft on the gravel path. "You're up early," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. I couldn't sleep, I admitted, stepping back to study the painting. Thought I'd get some work done while it's quiet. She walked closer, her gaze drifting to the canvas. It's beautiful, she said, her tone warm but wistful. You've captured it perfectly. I glanced at her, noticing the pallor in her cheeks, the way her hand trembled as she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. How are you feeling today? I asked gently. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. I've had better days, she said honestly. Have you told the doctors? She shook her head. It wouldn't change anything. I know my limits, Thomas.
I'm okay.
Her words were calm, but they didn't ease the knot of worry in my chest. Over the past few weeks, she had grown weaker, her strength fading like the late autumn leaves. But she refused to let it define her, still moving through the hospice with quiet determination, still offering comfort to others even as her own body betrayed her. Lily, I began, but she held up a hand. Don't, she said softly. Don't look at me like that. I don't need pity. It's not pity, I said firmly. It's, I care about you, Lily, more than I think you realize. She met my gaze, her eyes glistening. I know, she said quietly, and I care about you too. That's why I need you to promise me something. Anything? I said, my voice trembling. She reached out, her hand resting on my arm. When it's my time, I don't want you to stop living, Thomas. I don't want you to shut yourself away or carry this weight alone. Promise me you'll keep painting, keep creating. Promise me you'll find joy, even when it feels impossible. Her words felt like a knife in my chest, but I nodded, unable to speak. The days that followed were a blur of quiet moments and unspoken goodbyes. Lily and I spent as much time together as we could, sitting in the garden, talking late into the night, sharing the kind of silence that only comes when two people truly understand each other. One evening, as the first snowflakes began to fall, she asked me to bring my sketchbook to her room. I want you to draw something for me, she said, her voice soft but steady. Anything, I said, sitting beside her. She smiled faintly. Draw the garden, the way it looks now with the snow. I nodded, opening the sketchbook and letting my pencil move across the page. She watched me work, her expression calm, her breathing slow and even. When I finished, I handed her the drawing. She studied it for a long moment, then looked up at me, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said. It's perfect. I stayed with her that night, sitting by her bedside as she drifted off to sleep. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater and the soft rustle of the snow outside. By morning, she was gone. The days after her passing were some of the hardest of my life. The hospice felt emptier without her, the garden less vibrant. James grieved with me, his own condition worsening, though he tried to hide it. You kept your promise, he said one afternoon as I sat by his bed, the sketchbook open on my lap. You were there for her, Thomas. That's all she wanted. I nodded, though the weight of her absence felt unbearable. It wasn't until weeks later, after James had passed as well, that I finally found the strength to return to the greenhouse. The painting I'd been working on still sat on the easel, unfinished, the colors muted under a layer of dust. I picked up my brush, my hand steady for the first time in weeks. With each stroke, I thought of Lily, her quiet strength, her laughter, the way she had believed in me even when I couldn't believe in myself. When the painting was finished, I stood back and looked at it. It wasn't just a garden. It was a memory, a tribute, a promise kept. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. Lily's light would stay with me, a quiet reminder to keep living, keep creating, and keep finding beauty, even in the hardest moments. As I left the greenhouse that evening, the stars overhead were brighter than I'd ever seen them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of hope.